This isn't my typical video format. Uh, I'm in my living room and I was getting ready to start a fire in the wood stove, and then I got an email from a parent from a kid that I once coached that shook me to my core. And so I put off building the fire. I even put off getting dressed, and I decided to sit here and make this video because this email is more than just a letter from a parent. It's more than a letter to a coach. It is an urgent warning to parents everywhere. To give you a little bit of a backstory on why I got this email and the meaning of it, I've coached off and on for 30 years. Sometimes I've coached the last 8 years straight, except for last winter because my family and I spent the winter in the Philippines. And now that we're in late November and the temperatures have gotten to where they are, I'm reminded why we did that. But we're here for the winter. I'm actually coaching basketball this winter. Forgive me if I seem a little under the weather. I'm not. I'm perfectly healthy. I'm exhausted and I'm hoarse from screaming at a game last night. I've spent the last 4 months coaching tackle football full time, 5 days a week, 4 months. It was a 30-hour week commitment, and it's finished. Last night was our last game. I would like to say it ended on a high note, but it didn't. We lost our league Super Bowl by 2 points. We were 6-2 for the season. Those 2 losses came at the hands of the same team. They beat us by 1 point earlier in the season. We ended up facing them again in the Super Bowl, and they beat us by 2 points. We beat every other team in the league, one of them twice. We had to beat the same team that almost beat us once. We had to beat them again to get to the finals. So I'm just exhausted. Then last night at the game, it was 30-something degrees. I was screaming the whole time. I feel like a truck hit me. So forgive my appearance, but I can assure you I'm not ill. I'm very healthy. When you've coached for as long as I have, you get to a point, and teachers could probably relate to this too. Anybody who deals with people, you get to the point to where you've kind of seen everything at least once. And then the longer you continue to do it, you get to the point to where you start to see some of the same things over. And that's beneficial to you as a coach or maybe as an educator because you've got some experience with that and you know how to better handle it. Something happened recently that kind of made me remember this experience we're going to talk about today. And that's why I sent an email out. I tracked down a gentleman I have not had contact with in almost 15 years. I never thought I'd hear back from him. I didn't even know if he'd still be alive, but alas, he is, and I did hear back from him. So here's the story behind this. It was the winter of 2009, 2010. I was on Fort Lewis, the Army base. It's now Joint Base Lewis McChord. McChord was an Air Force base right beside the Army base, Fort Lewis, and they combined them. So now it's one big military base. I spent 6 months there. I just returned from Iraq where I'd gotten injured. It was a non-combat related wound. While I was in that hospital, I had surgery. I had to go through rehab, counseling. It was a dark time in my life, and those were dark days. There was a man there, Sergeant First Class Eddie Baker, who I can clearly state saved my life. He saved my life by getting me out of my room. It was like dorm rooms, nicest place I ever stayed in the military. It was like better than my college dorms from back in college. But those of us who were there because of medical reasons from our deployments, we basically, the only time we'd leave our rooms was to go to our doctor's appointments, and then we'd sit in our rooms and we'd think about our problems. We'd think about the families we lost while we were deployed. For some of the guys and girls, it was the limbs they lost while they were deployed, the mental stability we lost. And while I was there for 6 months, 5 soldiers made the choice to take their own lives. And if it hadn't been for Sergeant First Class Eddie Baker, I might have been number 6. He would come get me. He'd drag me out. He'd say, "Come on, Specialist Lake. Let's have lunch. Come on, Specialist Lake. Let's go to a football game." Because we had donors that would just give stuff to the Wounded Warriors Project, and then they'd pass it on to us. And I went to 3 Seattle Seahawks NFL football games while I was there. I went to 2 or 3 Tacoma Rainier baseball games. And through another individual that was very instrumental in me getting through those dark days, I ended up coaching basketball for like a regional fitness center. It wasn't the YMCA, but it was very similar to the YMCA. They had 3 or 4 gyms throughout the greater Seattle/Tacoma area. Because Sergeant First Class Baker told me, he says, the worst thing anybody here can do is just stay alone all the time, isolated in your hole, thinking about your problems. And so he got me out. So while I was coaching, there was an incident. And that's bringing us up to speed here with this urgent warning to parents everywhere. It's a letter from a parent of one of those kids I coached that year. So we had 12 kids on the team, and it was a mix in all ways, except gender. They were all boys. But there were white kids, there were black kids, Latino kids, Asian kids. Ironically, there's a very large Filipino community in the Seattle area. And that's ironic if you've never seen this channel, because my wife's Filipino and our son is biracial. He's half Filipino, half Caucasian American. He's 13 years old now, and he was one of 2 quarterbacks. We had 2 quarterbacks on our football team this season. It was my son's first year to play tackle football. He's played flag football for 6 years, 7 years. He made the transition well. He did great. Couldn't be prouder of him. So anyway, there was a mix of socioeconomics. We had rich kids, we had poor kids, and we had middle class kids. They were as much of a mixed group as you could imagine. So we're shooting foul shots one day. It was a nice court, baskets on both ends, and then they had the practice baskets you could lower, 2 on each side. So the place had 6 basketball rims. We had 12 kids. So while we were just warming up, shooting foul shots, we had 2 kids at each basket. One kid would shoot 5 or 10 shots. The other kid would get the rebounds, and they'd switch. So me and a couple of the other coaches were standing there watching these kids shooting foul shots. And one kid from one line just walks across the court, and he taps this kid getting ready to take a foul shot on the shoulder. Kid turns around. This kid says something. This kid says something else. This kid says something else. And then this kid just hauls off and punches that kid, knocks him on the ground, busts his nose, hit him right in the nose. So we run over there, and our first, we're down on the ground with this kid. He's bleeding. He's crying. We're like, are you okay? He was fine in the grand scheme of things, right? So then we thought, what's going on? So we turned around. The kid that had punched him, he's just shooting foul shots like nothing ever happened. Nothing, just boom, he's making them. So I go over there to that kid, and I say, what just happened right there? And he said, that kid needed to learn a lesson he clearly has not learned by this point in life, and I'm the guy that just taught him that lesson. I said, well, what lesson is that? He says, well, he clearly has never learned when to keep his mouth shut. And so I taught him. Now, here's what happened. There was a third kid involved. It wasn't the kid that punched the kid who got punched. It wasn't the kid that got punched. There was a, what would you call it, button pusher or a instigator. Here's the deal. There were 2 kids on the team that were so much alike, they hated each other. One of those kids was the kid that ended up getting punched, and the other kid was the kid that was always going back and forth with this kid. Here was the situation between these 2 kids. They were spoiled brats. They were kids of privilege who had never had to do anything for themselves. They never had to mow a lawn, wash a dish, throw away their trash. We would have practice, and these kids in the very beginning, if they had snacks and eat their snacks, all the other kids, the other 10, they'd throw their stuff in the trash can, which was like 10 feet away. These 2 kids would leave it there. They wouldn't even pick up their trash to put in the trash can because they came from backgrounds where either mom always did it for them or a maid always did it for them. You know what I'm talking about, right? So these kids, they were so much alike, they had the same name. Their name was Stephen, or their names were Stephen. Both named Stephen. One spelled his with a V in the middle, and the other spelled his with a PH. That's how we'd say, hey, PH Stephen, come over here. Or, hey, V Stephen, come here. That's how we told them apart. So the Stevens were bickering because they didn't get along because they were both so privileged and arrogant and snobby that they wanted to convince the other that they were better than the other. They both knew collectively in their own little privileged minds that they were better than everybody else on the court already because they had more stuff than them. But they had to, they were battling it out between who was better between them. I got more stuff than you. My house is bigger than yours. My parents' bank account has more zeros or whatever. And one of them said to the other, you know, sometimes I wish I were poor. In moments like this, I wish I were poor. And then the other one said, yeah, well, why is that? And the other one said, well, because I'd kick your backside right now. And the guy says, well, go ahead and do it. The other Stephen said, go ahead and do it if you think you can. The other Stephen says, well, no, I'm not going to do that because violence is the actions of the poor people, the lower classes, the peasants. He says, you know what, though? You know what I will do? I'm going to go pay somebody to kick your backside right now. So when we saw that kid going across the court, what he was doing, he tapped the other kid on the shoulder. This was the guy that he was asking this kid if he would take $20 to go over there and beat the other kid's backside. Well, the kid that turned around, he said, well, I'm not going to do that. Why would I do that? And the guy was like, well, because I'm going to give you $20. I can't stand the guy. I want you to beat him up. And the guy says, well, you go beat him up. And the guy says, well, no, because I'm rich and you're poor and violence is of the lower classes. Bam, that's when the kid hit him, knocked him down on the floor and turned around and just kept shooting his foul shots, making them all. So that's the story behind the story. So as you might imagine, me and the other coaches, we had to have conversations with 3 sets of parents that day. We had to talk to the kid that did the punching. We had to talk to the kid that got punched. And we had to talk to the kid who set all that up by, who was bickering with the other. He was part of it, okay? So the first parents we ended up talking to was the kid that actually punched the other kid. We told him what happened. And they said, so is he off the team? And we said, no, nobody's getting kicked off. They're like, is he suspended? And we said, no, we want to give you the information we have. And there's always more to every story. But we said, we want to give you the information we have and then let you as parents determine how you're going to handle it outside of the gym, at home. But we absolutely want your son to come back and be a part of this team. And we believe all these kids could probably be best friends by the end of the season. This is what kids do. This is, it's always something, man. And it never stops. I was in the Army, and that is just one big male reproductive organ measuring contest. And that one's based on rank. I'm not trying to be inappropriate, guys. So anyway, the parents of the kid who punched the other kid in the face, once they found out their kid wasn't kicked off the team, wasn't suspended, they swelled with pride. And they both patted him on the back. They says, well, we raised him not to put up with any crap because the real world's full of it. And we'll talk to him and we're going to make sure that he understands next time. And, they put something in the middle. Instead of just hauling off and punching somebody, come to a coach and say, hey, if this kid doesn't stop this, I'm going to punch him in the face. That's how they chose to handle it. We never had a problem with that kid again. Okay. The next group of parents that came in were it was the mother and the father. They came in, and it was the kid who set it all up. It was the kid that was having a hit put out on him, right? This was the kid that the other kid was willing to pay money to have beaten up. So the kid that was out there being shopped for somebody to beat him up, the parents came in, we told them what happened. We said, this is our understanding. Your son and this other son was bickering about this reason, very ugly reason. And so the other kid went to, actually pay this other kid to punch him. But that was, let me tell you folks, I've seen that since more than once. There's just, kids will be kids, okay? Well, here was the reaction we got. The father never said anything. It's as if he wasn't allowed to talk. He just stood there like a drone. I raised bees. It's like his only purpose was to provide reproduction, and that was it. The mother said, well, I tell you what, coaches, I'll solve this problem for you. I'll just take Stephen, PH Stephen, off of this team. You'll never see him again. He won't be back, and that'll solve this problem. You won't have to worry about any more problems associated with PH Stephen. And I said to her, ma'am, that's, we're not kicking him off the team. He's not even suspended. We're just giving all the parents the information we have. There's always more to the story. Maybe he knows something we don't. We believe that by the end of this season, he can be best buddies with these guys. And we want him to be on this team. And she was like, nope, you'll never see my child again. And we never did. They left the gym. The father never said a word. He walked out with his head up, but man, was he kind of slouched. He looked like somebody who had just been henpecked and browbeaten and just never got in the way of how his wife mothered their son. He just let her do it. And that's the last I ever saw of him. Never saw of him or never saw him or heard of him again. Well, in walks the father of the kid that got punched in the face. And one of the coaches, we had flip phones back then. He had been notified, so he knew his kid had been hit. He was fine. So he didn't come in all shocked and worried because his kid was all bloodied and all this. We gave him the exact same information that we had given the other two sets of parents, okay? He put his head down, and I thought, oh, here it comes. He's going to take a perfectly wonderful kid who's just a little bit misdirected right now, and he's going to take him off the team. Even though we told him we're not kicking him off the team, he's not suspended and all this. He looks up at me, he says, Coach, thanks for telling me this. He says, we hear things from his teachers. We hear things from you, the coach. We hear things from him. We know what goes on at home. All the things aren't the same thing, but they do add up to something. This guy, you could tell, I liked him. And he says, so is he off the team? No. Again, he's not off the team. He's not suspended. We hope he comes back to practice tomorrow. And they left. And I thought, well, we're never going to see that kid again. The only kid that remains is the kid that did the punching, right? And I thought, well, I guess no one's going to mess with that kid, so at least we won't have to worry about that. Well, the next day, the kids came back to practice, and we did see the kid that had been punched in the face the day before. And not just that, we saw his father again. Now, let me point this out to you. The day before that was the first time we'd ever met his father. Most of these kids, and it happens today, and this is common, and I've done this at times when I've coached and not been actively participating. You pull up to the gym, you pull up to the field, your kid jumps out, you take off, and you come back, you pull up. When practice is over, the kid jumps in the car, and you go home. That's how 90% of people do it. There are those 10% of parents who are more actively involved with the kids. They'll coach, they'll parent volunteer. Some of them will just sit around and watch practice because they enjoy it. But this guy was one of those guys. We had never seen him because he dropped the kid off or his wife would drop the kid off. He'd leave, come back, get him at practice. So it was noticeable when that kid came back to practice the next day and that father came in with him. And the father, by the way, was not dressed in business casual as he had been the day before. The man was clearly an educated professional. To this day, even though I got an email from him overnight at a very serendipitous time to get it because we just ended our season. I emailed him about 10 days ago. He was dressed in workout clothes and he had running shoes on. And he comes up and he says, Coach, is it okay if I just kind of watch you guys and keep an eye on my kid today, V Steven? And by this point, we're just calling him Steven because the other one was gone. I said, absolutely, that'd be great. Some of these other parents hang out. They're wonderful people. Go talk to them and watch his practice. It's like, okay. So he goes over, he sits down on the bench. I had the kids run their 4.5 laps on the basketball court. FYI, 25 laps around the basketball court's a mile. So I wanted to run 200 meters, not a lot, just enough to get loose so we could stretch out, do some calisthenic warm-ups, get into practice. So we do that. We form our circle. All the kids are doing their thing, except for the kid that had been punched in the face that day. Him and a couple of other kids were standing off to the side. And let me point out that before this incident, that kid and the other kid that was no longer with us, PH Steven, they were always standing off at the side most of practice. They were malingering. It's called malingering. We saw it in the Army. You see it in sports. You're going to see it everywhere. You see it at the workforce. There are those people who you don't know why they haven't been fired. Why are they even here? They do 10% of the work everybody else does. They always have an excuse. So anyway, this kid was standing there malingering with the other malingerers on the team, and his dad got up from the stands, the bottom stand he was sitting on, comes marching across the court and says, Steven, you get down there right now and you do everything else these other kids are doing. You can do, I forget what it was we were doing, but it was calisthenic warm-ups. He says, you can do that and you can do everything else these kids can do. You are no different than them and you are no better than them. You get down there and do it right now. That kid got down there and he did it. And he cried while he did it. And it's not so much because what he was doing was hard. It had nothing to do with that. It's because he was embarrassed. He had been taken down a few notches. Verbally as it was. He'd been taken down a few notches the day before by the other kid who punched him in the face. But then he'd just been taken down a few notches more by his father. Okay? That dad stayed out there on the court with us coaches and those kids that entire practice to make sure his kid participated in all drills, all activities, and wasn't going around looking down at anybody for any reason. He said, Stephen, you're here to play basketball, and that's it. At the end of that practice, I approached that dad and I said, would you like to help us coach for the rest of the season? And he laughed and he says, I can't be here all the time because I have my own business. He says, but I'm going to rearrange a lot of things in my life. And one of those things is going to be that my hours of when I do work, because I'm going to be here as much as I can be. And for the rest of that season, he was there at least every other practice. He never missed a game. His wife would come to the games. I never met her. I would see her. We'd smile and wave and hi, but I never had a conversation with her. But that father who, before that point, from what I could see and from kind of what I've had confirmed in this email, he'd just not been actively involved in his son's life to the degree that he could have been and probably should have been. But that was his wake-up call. He became active more active in his son's life. And by the end of that season, him and the kid that punched him in the face were like buddies. And as you'll soon see as I read this email, to this day, how many years ago? 13, they're 26, 14 years ago, they remain friends. I don't want to give you the end of the story before I read the beginning. I'm going to read you the email. Again, like I said, once you've done this as long as I have, you get to where you see the same things over and over. And I saw something very similar this time around. And so I thought of this guy. When I've had the same email since the year 2000, 24 years. I delete spams, but if it's an email that I need to read, I read it, and I just don't go back through and delete them. So I have like 18,000 emails from 2000 until now. And so I was putting in every keyword I could in the email search box to try to pull up any sort of contact I had with this guy's dad. His name is Steve too, by the way. I found him. I sent him an email almost 2 weeks ago, and I said, I don't know if you will remember me. I hope you're still alive. But I wanted to reach out and just ask you how things turned out with V. Stephen. Okay, this is V. Stephen's dad. I got an email last night while I was asleep. Again, they're still out on the West Coast, so they're 3 hours behind us. So what was midnight to me was 9 p.m. for him. He took the time to send me this email, and I'm going to read it to you now. Because, again, I got fingerprints all over these glasses. This is not just a letter from a parent to a coach. This is an urgent warning to parents everywhere. Kevin, that's me, if you're not a regular of this channel. You cannot imagine my surprise to receive your recent email. Shock might be a better word. Believe it or not, I've actually followed you on social media for many years now. I've never reached out to you because I would imagine you're inundated with daily contacts, and I simply didn't want to add to the pile out of respect for how busy I can only imagine you are. Straight to it. Stephen is great. He's 27 years old now and still living here in the Tacoma area. I'm proud to say he's not living with his mother and me like so many of his peers he grew up with. He lives with his fiancée, a wonderful young woman named Natalie, with whom he went to high school. They knew each other in school vaguely, but parted ways completely during college as they went to separate universities. But ironically, they ended up running back into each other at work after they graduated. Stephen graduated from Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, with a teaching degree. He is a middle school PE teacher and he coaches multiple sports. His fiancée is a guidance counselor at his school. They both started working for the school the same year, and by the end of that first year, they were as close as any couple I've ever seen, and they really have a wonderful relationship today, nearly 5 years after having begun their relationship. Though they are not yet married, they do own a home together. They've been testing cohabitation for the past couple of years, and they're working on building their financial base before taking things to the next level, and certainly before having children of their own. But I have full confidence they are going to be just fine. To this day, Kevin, I cannot thank you enough for having the courage to have that difficult conversation with me that we had when Stephen had his incident, as we've come to call it, involving those other two kids all those years ago. That difficult situation helped me as much as a father as it did my son Stephen as a 13-year-old boy. Here's what I never told you back then, Kevin, but what I am happy to share with you now. I knew years before Stephen's incident that he was in trouble. He was not on track to grow up to become what I hoped he would become, and for years I blamed his mother for over-mothering him and, as you know, his environment and the people in it. I blamed so many of the things so many other lazy parents blame for the downfall of their children's proper upbringing, like video games and music, and for a while in his very late teen years, experimentation with various substances. But I knew in my gut the whole time that I was as much to blame as anything because I was under-fathering. That was my part in it. You see, Kevin, what you didn't know at the time of our conversation is that I grew up very underprivileged in a very undesirable section of Tacoma. My father left my mother and me and my two younger siblings when I was only 6 years old. I have very few memories of the man, and the ones I have are not pleasant. When our father left, my brother was 4 and my baby sister was 2. My mother was left to raise all 3 of us. By the time I was 10, I was mowing yards in the summer and shoveling walks in the winter to help support our family. During my teen years, I always had after-school jobs, and I spent my entire summers working. I did everything back then from what I've already mentioned to working in fast food joints, and while in college, I was a janitor for Boeing Corporation on the overnight shift while I took classes during the day at Everett Community College. I'm sorry. I didn't know any of this. When that man walked in the gym, I judged him. I was wrong. Throughout my childhood, I vowed, though I was growing up as what many back then simply called poor, I was not going to stay poor, and that when I had kids of my own, they would not know the hardships I knew. And it wasn't just about lack. It was about ridicule. As hard as I worked and as hard as I saw my mother work, she usually had 2 jobs, and as much love as we had for each other, my mother and my siblings, it was not uncommon. In fact, it was very common to receive constant beratement, which is no less a form of bullying than any other form of bullying from so many of the rich kids, as we called them back then. Today they use different terms, privileged versus underprivileged, upper socioeconomic status versus lower socioeconomic status. But it is what it is, rich versus poor, haves versus have-nots. What I can say from experiencing both ends of the spectrum is that no matter what you call it, it's all the same. And when you're on the bottom, being looked down upon by folks who consider themselves to be on top, it leaves a lasting scar. And that scar is largely why I ended up being in a position of underfathering. And it's why I say that when you and I had that difficult conversation, you helped me as much as you helped my son, Stephen. After college, and by the way, I was the first person in my family to ever go to college, let alone graduate, I secured a job in my chosen line of work. I soon realized I was putting forth my time and effort to benefit my employer while only being compensated enough to not be poor, yes, but never truly get ahead. Sure, I could go into mountains of debt and make it look like I was rich, but I know the hell that leads to, and I wanted no part of it. So after 2 years at my employer, a period of time in my life which I view as my apprenticeship, I struck out on my own in the line of work I'm in, and it's made all the difference. After 10 long, hard years of effort, during which time I fell back on the work ethic I didn't even realize I was building within myself during my underprivileged childhood and young adult years, I succeeded. I now have a couple dozen employees who do all the work I used to do for me, though I am constantly watching the running of my business like a hawk. And I've enjoyed 20 years of running the business from behind the scenes, putting in far less time and effort than in those early years, and life is good. However, it was during that business build-up period, the tail end of it, that Stephen had his incident. We were living in a very nice, privileged community outside of Tacoma. My wife, Stephen's mother, was teaching. And that's half the reason Stephen went into teaching. I'll explain the other half soon. And I was plugging away at my business, celebrating year after year of consistently increased earnings. Stephen was the oldest of our three kids. Ironically, he has a younger brother and sister just like I did. And as much as we wanted to assume that we were doing well as parents and that Stephen and his siblings were becoming well adjusted, my gut told me that wasn't the case. In truth, I really would have had no way of knowing because neither my wife nor myself at the time were involved in our children's lives to any great degree. Sure, we were married, so they had a mom and a dad, a luxury I never enjoyed, and they had all the trappings of the upper middle class lifestyle. If our kids wanted anything, they got it. However, we were not requiring anything from them for them to get it. We simply gave it to them. As an earner and a provider, I was proud to be able to give my children anything and everything they desired. All the things I never had, they did. This is what it's all about, I thought back then. I worked super hard my whole life so my kids would have all the things I didn't. This would make my kids whole as I saw it. They would not develop those deeply ingrained feelings of inferiority and insecurity that's associated with having grown up underprivileged that I had. Sure, it was that want from having known lack that spurred me in my youth to do all the work that I did to get to where I am, and I did not want my kids to know the pain of constantly being looked down upon like a second-class citizen by all the privileged little, I'll use the word people here, he used a different word, like the ones I grew up with. Kevin, when you came to me that evening, after Stephen's basketball practice, and told me about what had happened, about the incident, in that singular moment, I realized that though I was quite the successful earner and provider I'd become, I had not become a very good father at all. For you see, I was raising my kids, all of them, to simply become the same privileged little people I'd always hated myself. My wife and I had a long discussion after I left the gym that night. Like myself, my wife had grown up knowing challenges that most of our neighbors in our upper middle class zip code had never nor would ever know. And she agreed that the way we were doing things were leading to a train that was running off the tracks. And that if we didn't right it now, while there was still time left, the lives of our children would end up in train wrecks. Sure, we'd always be able to provide for them due to the pace my business was on, at least we thought and hoped so, but what an injustice we were doing, raising them in such a way that they would never be able to provide for themselves. And to know that my son was treating underprivileged kids out there the same way I was treated at that age by privileged people because of my home life, and that these underprivileged kids were viewing my son, Stephen, through the same eyes that I once viewed my tormentors, well, that did not sit well with me. My wife and I began making immediate adjustments. You saw the first adjustment I made after she and I had vowed to do so the next day at basketball practice after Stephen's incident, when I went out there on the basketball court and made him do all the same things the other kids were doing. I know he always had an excuse for why he couldn't do whatever the kids were doing, but I knew it was just that, an excuse. For years, I tolerated his excuses, as I did with his younger siblings, simply because I didn't want to get involved. I was consumed with my work, and I didn't want to step away from it to be more involved in my children's lives and to be the father I needed to be. You see, I thought I was already being that father by simply providing, but alas, I found out this was not the case. It's about more than just providing. It's about more than being there. And I don't mean simply being there in the same house. I mean being there at practices, games, school functions, being approachable during those tough times in a kid's life, as I'm proud I was during Stephen's late teen years, so that he knew he had someone he could be open with, yet someone more than a teacher or even a coach or a counselor, a parent, who should always be a child's first go-to. I was not being that parent for the first 13 years of Stephen's life, and as successful as I viewed myself as being due to my accomplishments, I realized that I had been failing as a parent. It wasn't easy for my wife and me to make these parenting adjustments. There were times when we actually discussed divorce, even though we knew that she and I were equally guilty in our lackluster parenting. She was over-mothering Stephen and his brother, while I was under fathering them, and I was over fathering our daughter while she was under mothering her. My wife and I actually ended up going to couples counseling for about a year. We made it through those tough times and we're still together, and we can both look back on those times now and realize the growth was worth the pain because all of our children are responsible, well-adjusted, self-supporting, and most proudly, not the stuck-up snobby jerks that she and I, and let's face it, most people despise. I'm not a fan. I mentioned that Stephen's mother is half the reason he went into teaching. They were always close, even after she cut the apron strings many years after she should have, but which, by God's grace, still wasn't too late. You, Coach, are the other half of the reason Stephen went into teaching. He knew that he would always be able to secure coaching positions if he worked for a school, and coaching was something that he wanted to do as well as teach, and you are the reason why. Coach, your influence affected my son tremendously, and it continues to have lasting effects on him today. You asked about the other two kids involved in the incident. Sadly, I have no idea of P.H. Stevens' whereabouts. I hope the best for him because I know he was not a bad kid. There is no such thing as a bad kid. There are, however, bad parents, and I know this because at the time my wife and I were bad parents. If I had to wager, I bet P.H. Stephen is very comfortable being taken well care of somewhere, most likely in his parents' basement. And I do not say this to be cynical. It is a reality we live in today that a disturbingly large percentage of young adults my son's age are still at home. I know we've had issues with the economy, but the young people who are out there on their own, like my Stephen, working and supporting themselves and their families if they have them, have gone through the same economy the rest of us have. In my opinion, and based upon my experience of having grown up a have-not and having worked my way into a have, I am 100% convinced that the young adults out there not taking care of themselves are in such a position because they were never put in a situation where they had to do anything for themselves. As far as the kid who punched my son in the face, he's a state trooper for the state of Washington. He and my Stephen stayed in touch after that season, for as you might remember, they became close by season's end. They always went to different schools, but fortunately social media was a thing by then, and they stayed in contact that way via Facebook. They would get together in person throughout their schooling years, and they see each other occasionally today. That kid, and his name's Jimmy, by the way, in case you've forgotten, didn't have the money to go to college after high school, and he didn't want to take out student loans and go into debt, so he instead went into law enforcement at the local level first, but he eventually made his way to the state police academy, and he is doing a fine job as a state trooper. He's married and has a 3-year-old son. He named his son Stephen, with a V. Please do stay in touch, Coach. I know Stephen would love to be in contact with you, and if I have your permission, I would love to forward your email address to him so he can contact you if you don't mind. They say you never know how far your influence on a child might go. I have seen how far your influence has gone with my son, and I can only imagine how many other kids you may have possibly affected throughout your coaching career. I, too, thank you for giving me that wake-up call all those years ago. Stephen and most likely his younger siblings were trains getting ready to derail as far as life in the real world goes. A world that I know through firsthand experience is hard and mean. It's a world that gives no quarter, and anything worth having must be earned. When it's given, it has no meaning. And if one is in a position where one cannot be given anything because there's no one there with the means to give, one must work. And if we don't instill within our children work ethic, respect for others, and self-respect, and the idea that no one is better than anyone else simply because of the size of the house they live in or the number of digits in their parents' bank account, we are doing our children a disservice. We are setting them up for failure. If my wife and I were to have continued down the road we were on, and God forbid anything had happened to us or our business, and we were to lose everything, we would have ended up raising 3 adults who probably would have starved because they would not have known how to take care of themselves, because at the rate we were going, we were not teaching them how to do so. Thanks again for the email, and it would be great if I could hear from you from time to time, but I understand you're busy with your own life. And by the way, I've watched your son grow up on YouTube, and I'm not surprised that he's become the disciplined, hardworking, respectful, and achieving young man that he has. Keep coaching, coach. There are kids out there from the haves to the have-nots who need you, and a lot of parents too. Best always, Steve.